Commander Arel Ven had written war assessments for 32 standard cycles. In that time, he had evaluated 47 intelligent species across 12 star regions, advised 3 coalitions during active conflict, and authored the report that ended the Kethri expansion before it began. His conclusions were precise, unemotional, and most importantly, correct. They always had been. The Strategic Assembly trusted him more than they trusted their own admirals. So when they assigned him to observe the newest faster-than-light civilization on the edge of mapped space, Arel Ven did not feel concern. He did not feel curiosity. If he was honest with himself, he felt something closer to mild inconvenience. Humans. The file was thin. 43 years since first faster-than-light jump. One homeworld. A handful of colonies, most of them recently established and still dependent on supply lines. Ship designs inconsistent. Engineering standards flexible. Combat doctrine largely untested against anything more advanced than localized threats. On paper, they were exactly what every young species was at this stage. Ambitious. Loud. Temporary. His assignment parameters were simple. Observe human military capability. Evaluate threat potential. Recommend one of 3 actions. Initiate diplomatic integration. Monitor and delay. Or quietly ensure they never became a problem. Arel had completed more complex assessments in less than a week. He expected this one to take 2. He positioned his observation vessel in high orbit above the human homeworld, cloaked beyond their detection capabilities. The planet rotated slowly beneath him, blue and white and unremarkable in the way that most life-bearing worlds were. His sensors selected a military installation within a dry continental region the humans designated as a desert training zone. Efficient environments revealed inefficient species quickly. He settled into his command chair and began. The first hour confirmed his expectations. The base was disordered. There was no other word for it. Personnel moved without visible formation. Groups formed and dissolved without clear structure. Some individuals appeared to be working. Others were sitting. A few were lying down in the shade of large ground vehicles. There was sound, unregulated, unnecessary sound, projected across the installation. Rhythmic noise, sharp and repetitive, which one of his junior analysts identified as recreational audio. 2 soldiers near a transport unit were engaged in what appeared to be a non-productive interaction involving repeated physical gestures and elevated vocal output. One of them leaned against the vehicle, unable to maintain balance due to what the translation software hesitantly classified as laughter. Arel watched them for several seconds. He made his first note. Subject species exhibits irregular discipline patterns. Behavioral cohesion unclear. He continued observing. A group of 4 personnel sat near a supply crate, consuming packaged nutrition units. One of them finished, compressed the container, and threw it at another. The second individual responded in kind. The third joined. The fourth attempted to avoid involvement and failed. No reprimand followed. No authority figure intervened. Arel shifted slightly in his chair. Lack of enforcement structure, he added. Near the center of the base, a larger piece of equipment, an armored device of some kind, had been partially disassembled. A human in standard uniform stood beside it, applying a strip of gray adhesive material to an external panel. He paused, examined his work, then added another strip. And another. Arel narrowed his eyes. Improvised maintenance practices, he recorded. He leaned back, folding his hands. There was a pattern here. Not a complex one. Young species often struggled with standardization. They relied on creativity where discipline would have been more efficient. It was not unusual. It was, in fact, expected. Still, something about the environment held his attention longer than it should have. It was not just disorganization. It was comfort. The humans did not behave like a military force stationed on a strategic installation. They behaved like individuals occupying a familiar space. There was no visible tension. No underlying urgency. No indication that they were preparing for anything beyond the next immediate task. One of the personnel units, designation, Sergeant, according to translation, walked through the area. His posture suggested authority. His presence did not alter behavior in any significant way. He spoke to a group. They responded. One of them said something that caused the others to produce that same sharp, uncontrolled vocalization. The sergeant did not correct them. He continued walking. Arel tapped a control panel, bringing up comparative footage from other species he had observed at similar stages. The difference was immediate and stark. Order, structure, predictability. Even inexperienced militaries understood the value of visible discipline. These humans did not. Possible cultural deviation, he noted, may impact combat effectiveness. He paused. For a moment, he considered ending the session early and drafting a preliminary recommendation. There was little here that suggested long-term concern. The assembly would likely opt for monitored engagement. Slow integration. Controlled contact. Safe. Routine. Arel almost closed the file. Then his sensor array registered a scheduled training cycle. He adjusted his posture slightly, giving the screen more of his attention. If there was competence, it would appear here. If there was not, the report would be even shorter than expected. Below, a signal was given. The scattered personnel began to gather. Not immediately, not perfectly, but within a time frame that, while inefficient by assembly standards, was not entirely unreasonable. They formed loose lines. Instructions were delivered. Movement began. Running, climbing, repetition of physical tasks designed to test endurance and coordination. Arel watched carefully. There were inefficiencies, minor ones, variations in technique, inconsistencies in form. But there was also something else. No one stopped. No one disengaged. Even the individuals who had previously appeared disengaged now moved with a level of effort that did not match their earlier behavior. Arel leaned forward, just slightly. Endurance compliance, higher than initial assessment, he murmured, more to himself than to his crew. The drill continued. Dust rose from the ground. Voices carried across the training field. Commands were given, sometimes loudly, sometimes not at all. And still, the humans continued. Not perfectly, but completely. Arel did not update his notes immediately. He watched. Because for the first time since arriving in orbit, a small and unfamiliar thought had entered his mind. Not concern. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. He adjusted the recording parameters, increasing resolution, expanding data capture. 2 weeks, he had told the assembly. He now suspected he might need the full duration. He rested one hand on the console and looked down at the chaotic, noisy, inefficient military installation on the surface of the human homeworld. And for reasons he could not yet clearly define, he did not close the file. By the 3rd day of observation, Commander Arel Ven had developed a working hypothesis. Humans were not undisciplined because they lacked structure. They were undisciplined because they did not value it in the same way. He watched them through the morning cycle as the base came alive again under the pale light of their star. There was no sharp transition from rest to readiness. No clean shift in posture or tone. It happened gradually, almost invisibly. One moment they were sitting, talking, moving without urgency. The next, tasks were being completed, systems checked, equipment moved into position. There was no signal he could identify that marked the change. It simply happened. Arel found that inefficient. He also found it difficult to ignore. Near one of the outer vehicle bays, 2 soldiers were engaged in a conversation that seemed, by all measurable indicators, irrelevant. One was gesturing broadly, describing something with exaggerated motion. The other responded with intermittent vocalizations that translated loosely to agreement or disbelief. A third joined them briefly, added a comment, then left without disrupting the exchange. Behind them, a transport unit was being prepped for deployment. No one involved in the conversation appeared to be supervising the work. And yet the work was being done. Arel adjusted the sensor focus. 3 separate individuals were interacting with the vehicle. One checked the external plating. Another secured internal storage. A third ran a diagnostic scan. They did not speak to each other. They did not coordinate visibly. They did not need to. Task independence observed, Arel recorded quietly. Low communication requirement during routine preparation. He paused, then added, may indicate overfamiliarity with process rather than efficiency. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also, he suspected, incomplete. A sudden burst of sound drew his attention back to the central yard. The rhythmic noise from earlier had returned, louder now, accompanied by a cluster of personnel moving in ways that served no apparent purpose. One of them spun in place. Another attempted to mirror the motion and failed, nearly losing balance. The surrounding group reacted with what his system again identified as laughter. Arel watched in silence. Non-productive activity during active cycle, he noted. Sub-Commander Irix, standing to his left, tilted her head slightly. It appears to be a morale function, she offered. Arel did not look at her. It appears to be a waste of time. The movement continued for several more seconds before dispersing naturally, without instruction. The individuals involved returned to separate tasks as if the interruption had not occurred. No one corrected them. No one needed to. Arel exhaled slowly through his nose. There was a pattern forming again. Not in the behavior itself, but in the transitions. Humans moved between states, rest, activity, distraction, focus, without the rigid boundaries every other species enforced. The changes were fluid, unmarked, uncontrolled, or so it appeared. He shifted his attention to a smaller group near the weapons range. This, at least, should provide clarity. Weapons discipline was universal. It had to be. Every species that reached interstellar capability understood the necessity of precision, maintenance, and respect for destructive tools. The humans approached the range without ceremony. One of them carried a rifle loosely in one hand, the barrel angled safely but without the formal grip Arel expected. Another adjusted a strap across his shoulder while walking. A third was still speaking to someone behind him, turning his head as he moved. Casual handling of weapon systems, Arel said, recording. The group reached their positions. Targets were set at varying distances across a flat expanse of sand and reinforced material. Environmental conditions were stable. Wind minimal. Visibility high. Arel prepared to observe. One of the soldiers raised his weapon, sighted briefly, and fired. The shot struck center mass. Arel marked it. The second soldier followed. Slight adjustment. Fire. Impact within acceptable deviation. The third lifted his rifle and paused. He leaned forward, squinting slightly. One hand reached up and tapped the top of the weapon. A small component shifted. Arel zoomed in. The optical scope was misaligned. No, not misaligned. Detached. It was being held in place by a strip of the same gray adhesive material Arel had observed earlier. The soldier tapped it again. The scope tilted further to one side. There was a brief pause. The soldier looked at it. Then, with a motion that carried no urgency whatsoever, he pressed it back into position, reached to his belt, pulled free another strip of adhesive, and wrapped it around the connection point. Once. Twice. He smoothed it with his thumb. Arel felt something unfamiliar tighten slightly at the base of his neck. Improper equipment maintenance, he began. The soldier raised the rifle. Fired. The round struck the target precisely at center. Arel stopped speaking. For a moment, no one on the observation deck said anything. The soldier adjusted his stance, fired again. Second impact. Within negligible variance. Arel leaned forward, his earlier posture forgotten. Magnification, he ordered. The image expanded. The adhesive strip was clearly visible. The scope should not have held calibration under those conditions. It should have shifted, even slightly. Enough to affect accuracy. It did not. The soldier lowered the weapon, satisfied, and stepped back, allowing the next in line to take position. No comment was made. No correction issued. The action was treated as entirely normal. Arel stared at the screen for several seconds longer than necessary. Then, slowly, he reached for his datapad. Unverified anomaly, he recorded. Weapon modification inconsistent with standard engineering protocols. Resulting accuracy inconsistent with expected outcome. He hesitated. There were several ways to classify what he had just observed. Equipment failure compensated by operator skill. Unusual environmental stability. Coincidence. He selected the most reasonable. Further observation required. Behind him, Sub-Commander Irix shifted slightly. An isolated case, perhaps, she said. Arel did not respond immediately. On the surface, the humans continued their routine. Shots fired. Targets struck. Conversations resumed between attempts. One of the soldiers retrieved a spent casing and flicked it toward another, who caught it without looking. Casual. Unfocused. Effective. Arel set the datapad down carefully. Perhaps, he said at last. But he did not sound convinced. Because the hypothesis he had formed on the first day, simple, clean, dismissive, no longer fit as well as it had. There was too much noise in the data. Too many small inconsistencies. Individually, they meant nothing. Together. He looked back at the soldier with a taped scope as the man adjusted the weapon again, completely unconcerned with its condition. Together, they suggested something else. Something Arel was not yet prepared to define. He opened a new section in his report. And for the first time since beginning the assignment, he did not write a conclusion at the end of it. Commander Arel Venn did not believe in anomalies. In 32 cycles of assessment, every irregularity he had ever encountered had resolved into one of 3 categories: misinterpretation, environmental interference, or incomplete data. There was always an explanation. There had to be. So he rewound the footage. The soldier. The rifle. The adhesive strip. Frame by frame, he watched the moment again. The scope shifting. The correction. The shot. Perfect. He slowed the playback further. Micro-adjustments in posture. Breath control. Trigger discipline. All of it was within acceptable parameters for a trained marksman. Skilled, certainly. Above average, perhaps. But skill did not correct faulty equipment. Not completely. Run ballistic overlay, Arel said. A translucent grid appeared across the display. Wind vectors, gravitational constants, micro-variations in atmospheric density. The calculation ran in less than a second. Projected impact point. Deviation. Significant. Actual impact. Center. Arel felt that same tightening again. Check environmental interference. None detected, Irix replied immediately. Recalibrate sensor alignment. Already within tolerance. Arel did not respond. He watched the footage one more time. Then he closed it. Continue observation, he said quietly. Because one anomaly proved nothing. Two might. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Later that same cycle, a training drill was initiated across the eastern sector of the base. Larger scale. Coordinated movement. Multiple squads. This would provide better data. Arel adjusted the sensor array, expanding the field of view. The soldiers assembled with the same loose structure he had already documented. Conversations continued even as instructions were being delivered. One individual yawned openly. Another stretched, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for rest rather than exertion. Pre-engagement readiness low, Arel noted. The signal was given. Everything changed. It did not build. It did not transition. It snapped. The same individuals who had been relaxed, distracted, unfocused, were suddenly none of those things. They moved. Not faster, necessarily, but with purpose. Lines formed where there had been none. Spacing corrected itself without visible instruction. Communication dropped to near zero, replaced by short, precise signals, hand movements, brief words, glances that conveyed more than their length should allow. Arel leaned forward. Record all channels, he said. The drill unfolded across multiple vectors. One unit advanced across open terrain. Another took elevated position along a ridge. A third circled wide, using terrain features for cover. Standard tactics. But the execution. Arel's eyes tracked one squad in particular. 5 individuals moving through a narrow passage between structures. Their spacing was irregular. Their formation, at first glance, non-existent. Then one of them stumbled. It was a small thing. A misstep. The kind of error that, in most species, created a ripple. A break in rhythm. A moment of hesitation. Here it did not. The soldier behind him adjusted instantly, compensating for the shift before it fully occurred. The one to the left altered position by half a step. The lead did not slow. The formation, if it could be called that, absorbed the error. No pause. No disruption. As if the mistake had been expected. As if it had already been accounted for. Arel's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the console. Adaptive response, immediate, he murmured. The squad reached their objective point. Targets appeared, automated drones simulating hostile movement. Engagement began. Shots fired in controlled bursts. Movement continued between firing positions. One soldier dropped to a knee, providing cover. Another advanced past him without needing instruction. There was no visible command structure. No central voice directing the action. And yet, it was coordinated. Perfectly. Arel felt a flicker of something he had not expected to feel during this assignment. Not confusion. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. He expanded the view, watching multiple squads now. The pattern held. Disorder on the surface. Precision underneath. A soldier slid behind, cover a fraction of a second before a drone's targeting system locked onto his previous position. Another reloaded without looking, eyes fixed on the field ahead. A third signaled a change in direction with a gesture so small Arel almost missed it, and the entire unit adjusted accordingly. No delay. No confirmation. Just action. Cross-reference with known doctrine, Arel said. Unable to match, Irix replied after a brief pause. Arel expected that. Still, hearing it confirmed did not ease the tension building in his thoughts. Because what he was seeing did not fit. Not into any framework he had used before. The drill ended as abruptly as it had begun. A signal. Movement stopped. Weapons lowered. And just like that, the tension vanished. The soldiers relaxed. Conversations resumed. One of them removed his helmet and wiped his forehead, saying something that caused the others to produce that same uncontrolled laughter Arel had noted earlier. It was as if the previous 10 minutes had not happened. As if the precision, the coordination, the efficiency, had been a temporary state. Something they could enter. And leave. At will. Arel sat back slowly in his chair. For several seconds, he did not speak. On the surface, the base returned to its earlier state. Noise. Movement. Disorder. But now he had seen what existed beneath it. He reached for his datapad. Paused. Then began to write. The subject species does not maintain continuous readiness, he recorded. They do not adhere to standard structures of discipline or command visibility. He stopped. Looked back at the screen. A soldier near the edge of the field had picked up a piece of discarded equipment and was attempting to balance it on one finger, clearly for no operational reason whatsoever. Another watched, offering commentary. A third placed a small object on top of it, increasing the difficulty. Arel exhaled slowly. Then he continued writing. They transition between states. He hesitated again. Because the next part mattered. And for the first time in this report, he was not entirely certain how to phrase it. They transition, without loss of effectiveness. He read the line once. Twice. It was accurate. It was also incomplete. Because it did not capture the part that unsettled him. The speed. The immediacy. The lack of any visible mechanism controlling it. Arel set the pad down. He looked at the base again. At the soldiers who now appeared, once more, completely unremarkable. And a thought occurred to him. Quiet. Unwelcome. What if this was not a lack of discipline? What if this was a different kind of it? He did not write that down. Not yet. But he did not dismiss it either. Because the anomaly he had observed earlier, the taped scope, the impossible shot, it no longer stood alone. And Arel Ven did not believe in coincidences. Commander Arel Ven expanded the observation window to include the northern sector of the installation. If there was a pattern, it would repeat. Patterns always did. The next cycle provided it. The unit he selected was designated as a rapid response team. smaller than the standard formations he had been observing. Fewer personnel. Higher mobility. According to the data feed, they were considered elite within the structure of the base. Arel adjusted his posture. If any group would conform to recognizable standards, it would be this one. He initiated full-spectrum monitoring. The team was assembled in an open field bordered by low vegetation and scattered equipment crates. 12 individuals. 3 of them were lying on the ground. Not injured. Resting. One had an arm draped over his eyes, shielding them from the light. Another was propped against a pack, breathing slowly. A third appeared to be asleep. 2 more sat nearby, engaged in a game involving small rectangular objects spread across a flat surface. Their focus was absolute, but not on anything that resembled operational readiness. A 6th individual leaned against a crate, holding a food item wrapped in reflective material. He took a bite, chewed, and turned a page in a small printed book resting on his knee. Arel stared at the display. "Confirm unit designation," he said. "Rapid Response Team. Priority classification." "Hi," Irix replied. Arel did not look away from the screen. "Define high." Top 10% in response time and mission success rate. Arel was silent for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, "They are asleep." "Yes, Commander." He watched as one of the prone individuals shifted slightly, adjusting position for comfort. "During an active cycle." "Yes, Commander." Arel felt something cold settle into his thoughts. This was not disorganization. This was negligence. There was no other explanation that fit. He began recording. Elite unit displays severe lapse in readiness discipline. Multiple personnel non-responsive during operational window. Command oversight. A sudden spike registered across the sensor array. Arel's head snapped up. Source. Unknown. Brief electromagnetic fluctuation, Irix said, already scanning. Duration. Less than half a second. Intensity. Minimal. Harmless. Arel barely had time to process the data before the screen changed. The soldier with his arm over his eyes was on his feet. Not rising. Not pushing himself up. On his feet. The transition took less than a second. The others followed. The sleeping individual rolled, came up in a crouch, weapon already in hand. The 2 at the table scattered the objects without hesitation, hands moving to equipment. The man with the food item dropped it mid-motion, the wrapper hitting the ground as he pivoted toward cover. The book fell, forgotten. 12 individuals. Awake. Armed. Positioned. 2 seconds. Arel did not breathe. The formation, if it could be called that, formed instantly. Not in lines. Not in any structure Arel recognized. But the spacing was correct. The angles covered every approach. Fields of fire overlapped without interference. No one spoke. No orders were given. And yet, every movement had purpose. The squad leader, identified by insignia, was already in motion, shifting position along the perimeter, scanning the horizon with quick, precise head movements. A hand signal. 2 fingers. A direction. Half the unit adjusted. Another signal. Open palm. Hold. They froze. Weapons steady. Eyes moving. Searching. Arel felt his pulse increase, a rare and unwelcome physical response. "Time to readiness?" he asked, though he already knew. 2.1 seconds, Irix said quietly. Arel said nothing. Because that number was not possible. Not for a unit that had been, moments before, asleep. The field remained locked in silence. 10 seconds. 20. 30. No further disturbance. The electromagnetic fluctuation did not repeat. The squad leader lowered his hand slightly. Another signal. Stand down. The transformation reversed. Not slowly. Not cautiously. Instantly. Weapons lowered. Posture relaxed. One of the soldiers bent to pick up the dropped food item, inspecting it briefly before taking another bite. The man with the book retrieved it from the ground, brushing dust from the cover and returning to his previous page. The 2 at the table resumed their game as if nothing had interrupted it. The soldier who had been asleep lay back down, adjusting his position with a small exhale. Within seconds, the entire unit had returned to its previous state. Calm. Unfocused. At rest. Arel sat very still in his chair. For a long moment, no one on the observation deck spoke. Finally, Irix broke the silence. "Should I flag this for medical review?" she asked. The rapid state transition could indicate. "No," Arel said. His voice was quieter than usual. He did not look at her. "Do not flag it." He kept his eyes on the screen. On the soldier now lying on his back, one arm over his eyes again, as if nothing had occurred. As if the last minute had not redefined everything Arel understood about readiness. "They are not impaired," he said. More to himself than to anyone else. "They are efficient." The word felt insufficient. He reached for his datapad. Paused. Then began to write. "Initial assessment incorrect," he recorded. "Observed behavior does not indicate lack of discipline. Indicates alternative model of readiness." He stopped, because that was still not enough. It described what he had seen. It did not explain it. He looked back at the field, at the apparent disorder, the noise, the movement, the rest, and beneath it, the speed, the precision, the immediate, absolute transition to combat effectiveness. Arel exhaled slowly. Then he added a second line. "They are not unprepared." Another pause. This time, longer, because the next word mattered. It would define the rest of the report. He wrote it carefully. "They are resting." He set the pad down. And for the first time since beginning the assignment, Commander Arel Ven felt something he could not categorize within any known analytical framework. Not confusion, not fear, but the clear, undeniable awareness that he had misunderstood something fundamental. He looked at the humans below, at the soldiers who appeared, once again, entirely ordinary. And he realized he was no longer observing a predictable species. He was observing a problem, one he did not yet know how to solve. The border incident in the outer mining sector of Artis 9 was not expected to last more than 30 minutes. That was the official projection. Arel Ven read it twice before the operation began, not because he doubted it, but because it was so perfectly aligned with every model he had ever worked with. A small human colonial presence had established itself along the edge of a resource-rich region already marked for strategic assembly expansion. The response was procedural. A show of force. 3 patrol vessels. Standard broadcast. Clear demonstration of superiority. The humans would withdraw. They always did, at this stage. Arel positioned his observation vessel at a safe distance beyond engagement range, cloaked and passive. This time, he did not sit back casually. His posture was forward, attention fixed, data streams already open and recording at maximum resolution. He had extended his observation period without hesitation. He told himself it was for accuracy. He suspected it was for something else. The 3 assembly patrol ships entered the sector in clean formation. Their hulls reflected the distant light of the system star, smooth and deliberate in motion. Power signatures stable. Weapon systems online but not primed. Confidence. On the edge of the display, the human presence came into view. 2 cruisers. A converted cargo vessel. 4 smaller craft barely registering as military grade. Arel studied them in silence. The ships were inconsistent. Hull plating mismatched in places. External modifications visible even at range. Energy readings fluctuated slightly, suggesting non-standard distribution systems. Improvised. Inefficient. Outmatched. Probability of compliance. Irix asked quietly. Arel did not hesitate. 93%. It was a generous estimate. The assembly lead ship transmitted the standard message. 7 languages. Formal tone. Clear terms. Withdraw from the sector. Cease all claim. No escalation required. The transmission ended. Arel watched the timer. Response times were predictable. Most species replied quickly when faced with overwhelming force. Delay indicated confusion or internal conflict. At 42 seconds, the reply came. Audio only. Human language. Translated instantly. The voice was calm. Female. We received your message, she said. Could you hold for a moment? We're in the middle of something. Arel blinked once. He replayed the audio. Once. Twice. The words did not change. He felt Irix shift beside him. Commander. Arel did not answer immediately. Because in 32 cycles of observation, across 47 species, no one had ever responded to a formal military demand with a request to wait. He checked the timestamp again. 42 seconds. The assembly commander did not reply. For the first time in what was likely a very long career, he hesitated. 12 seconds passed. Then the human voice returned. Apologies, she said, same tone, same calm cadence. Now, you were saying... Arel stared at the display. He did not write anything, because he did not know how to categorize what he had just heard. The assembly ships adjusted formation slightly, tightening their approach. The message was repeated. This time, with less formality. The humans did not respond again. Instead, they moved. The two cruisers shifted first, positioning themselves between the patrol ships and the mining installation behind them. The smaller craft spread out, creating a loose perimeter. The cargo vessel. Arel focused on it. It was larger than the others. Slower. Not designed for combat. Its trajectory should have been defensive. It was not. It accelerated. Directly toward the lead assembly ship. Intercept vector, Irix said, surprised. Arel's eyes narrowed slightly. No, he said quietly. Not intercept. Because the angle was wrong. Too sharp. Too aggressive. The assembly pilot reacted as expected, adjusting course to avoid collision. Formation broke slightly, just enough to create space. That was all the human ship needed. It rolled. The maneuver was abrupt, inelegant, and entirely outside standard flight behavior for a vessel of that size. The cargo bay rotated into position, facing the assembly ship. Panels opened. Arel's sensors struggled for a fraction of a second to interpret what followed. Energy spike. Localized. Unstable. Commander, Irix began. Arel did not respond. Because what he was seeing did not fit any known weapons configuration. The cargo vessel's internal systems surged. Power rerouted. External attachments, tools, not weapons, shifted into alignment. Mining equipment. Drilling units. Repurposed. The energy discharge was uneven, crude, and devastating. It struck the assembly ship's outer shield at an angle no standard weapon would have used. The impact was not clean. It was chaotic, fluctuating, difficult to counter because it did not behave like anything the defensive systems were calibrated to handle. The shield held. For a moment. Then it flickered. Arel felt something in his chest tighten again. Damage report, he asked, though he already knew the answer would not be simple. Shield integrity compromised, Irix said, her voice lower now. Not fully breached, but unstable. The cargo vessel did not retreat. It should have. It did not. It pressed forward, maintaining pressure, forcing the assembly ship to divert more power to defensive systems. The smaller human craft moved in. Angles shifting. Vectors overlapping. Not coordinated by any visible command structure. And yet, they were not colliding. Not interfering. Each movement created space for the next. Arel's mind raced, mapping trajectories, predicting outcomes. None of them aligned with what he was seeing. This is not standard engagement behavior, he said. No, Irix replied softly. It isn't. The assembly ships attempted to re-establish formation. They could not, because the humans did not give them time. Every adjustment was met with another unexpected move. Another angle. Another pressure point. The battle, if it could be called that, did not follow a pattern Arel recognized. It should have been over. Quickly. Cleanly. Instead, it stretched. Minutes. Then hours. By the end of the first engagement cycle, Arel had stopped trying to predict the outcome. By the end of the second, he had stopped writing entirely. because the data no longer fit inside the frameworks he had built his entire career on. 11 days later, he was still watching. The 30-minute operation had become a prolonged conflict. The assembly ships had not won. The humans had not been destroyed. They held, with inferior numbers, inferior equipment, inferior everything. On paper. Arel sat in his chair, a cooling cup of untouched liquid beside him, his hands resting motionless on the console. He had reviewed the initial projections again. 30 minutes. He looked back at the screen. At the damaged but still operational human vessels. At the cargo ship, scarred, patched, still moving. At the smaller craft weaving through space in patterns that made no sense and yet achieved exactly what they needed. Arel exhaled slowly. Then, finally, he reached for his datapad. He did not write a full report. Not yet. Just a single line. The engagement did not proceed as expected. He paused, looked at the words, then added another. I do not understand why. And for Commander Arel Ven, that was not a statement. It was a problem. By the 12th day of the Ardus 9 engagement, Commander Arel Ven had stopped trying to categorize human tactics using existing doctrine. The attempt itself had become inefficient. Instead, he watched. He recorded. And he waited for the moment where the pattern, whatever it was, would reveal itself clearly enough to be named. It did not. It evolved. The cargo vessel was the first clear example. Arel isolated its data stream, replaying the previous engagements at increased speed. Frame by frame, he tracked its movements, its energy output, its structural integrity. It should not have survived the first exchange. Its hull composition was inconsistent. Reinforcement plating had been added in sections, not as a unified design. Internal systems drew power unevenly, suggesting modifications layered over original architecture without full integration. It was, by every measurable standard, an unstable platform. And yet it remained operational. More than operational. Effective. Cross-reference damage reports, Arel said. IRIX complied immediately. Hull integrity at 62%. Multiple breaches patched. Power grid rerouted at least 9 times since initial engagement. Arel's gaze did not leave the display. Improvised repairs? Yes, Commander. He watched as the cargo vessel drifted slightly, its thrusters adjusting in short, uneven bursts. External panels along its flank were mismatched, some scorched, some newly attached, some clearly taken from entirely different classes of ship. It looked like it had been rebuilt in motion. Because it had. Why is it still in the fight? IRIX asked quietly. Arel did not answer. Because the question itself assumed a framework that no longer applied. Instead, he focused on what the vessel did next. The assembly ships had adapted. Their formations were tighter now. Less room for disruption. Defensive systems recalibrated to account for the irregular energy signatures the humans were using. They were learning. So were the humans. The cargo vessel altered its approach vector. Not toward the lead ship this time. Away. Arel narrowed his eyes slightly. Retreat. IRIX suggested. No, Arel said immediately. Because the velocity was wrong. Too controlled. Too deliberate. The vessel accelerated past the engagement zone, drawing one of the assembly escorts with it. The maneuver was almost clumsy. Slight overcorrection in its trajectory. A delay in its thruster response. It looked like a mistake. The escort ship followed, seizing the opportunity. Pursuit confirmed, IRIX said. Arel did not move. He watched the distance between them close. Watched the cargo vessel continue to drift just ahead, maintaining a gap that was almost, but not quite, enough. Then the vessel's external cargo bay opened again. But this time, there was no energy surge. No weapon discharge. Instead, something small detached. Then another. Then dozens. Arel's sensors adjusted automatically, attempting to classify the objects. They were not weapons. Not in any conventional sense. Fragments. Debris. Components that should not have been part of any offensive system. The escort ship adjusted course, attempting to avoid collision. That was when the fragments activated. not with a single unified signal. Individually, each piece emitted a brief, sharp energy spike, not strong enough to damage shields directly, not precise enough to target systems, but together, they created noise, interference, a cloud of unpredictable signals that flooded the escort ship sensors with conflicting data. Sensor disruption, Irix said, her voice tightening. Arel leaned forward slightly. Because this was not random. It looked random. But the timing, the spacing, the activation sequence, it was controlled chaos. The escort ship's targeting systems faltered. Its tracking algorithms struggled to isolate the cargo vessel through the interference. For a fraction of a second, its defensive response lagged. That was all the humans needed. The smaller craft, which had disappeared from Arel's primary focus moments earlier, reappeared from multiple vectors. Fast, precise. They struck. Not at the hull. Not at the shields. At the exposed systems struggling to recalibrate. The escort ship's outer array failed first. Then its secondary thrusters. The vessel did not explode. It drifted. Disabled. Arel sat very still. His mind moved quickly, reconstructing the sequence. The retreat that was not a retreat. The debris that was not debris. The attack that did not look like an attack until it was already complete. Was that planned? Irix asked. Arel did not answer immediately. Because the correct response, the honest one, was not simple. He replayed the sequence. Once, twice, 3 times. Each time, the same conclusion formed. Yes, he said finally. But even as he said it, he knew that was not entirely accurate. Because planning implied predictability, structure, predefined steps. What he had just witnessed did not feel like that. It felt adaptive, as if the plan had existed only in parts, as if the outcome had been shaped in real time. Arel exhaled slowly. Then he reached for his datapad. The subject species demonstrates tactical behavior that does not conform to established strategic models, he wrote. He paused, then continued. They utilize improvisation as a primary combat function. Another pause. Because again, it was true. And again, it was incomplete. He looked back at the drifting escort ship. At the cargo vessel, now turning back toward the main engagement zone, its movement uneven but purposeful. At the smaller human craft, already repositioning for whatever came next. They do not rely on plans, Arel said quietly. Irix glanced at him. Then what do they rely on? Arel did not look away from the screen, because he was still forming the answer. They rely on outcomes, he said. The words felt closer. Not perfect, but closer than anything he had written so far. Because the humans did not seem concerned with how something should work, only with whether it did. And if it did not, they changed it, mid-action, without hesitation, without waiting. Arel set the datapad down. For the first time since the engagement began, he understood something clearly. Not everything, not even most of it, but one piece. And that piece was enough to shift the entire foundation of his assessment. He had been looking for logic, structure, predictable cause and effect. The humans were not operating without those things. They were operating beyond them. And that, Arel felt the thought settle into place, heavy and undeniable. That was far more dangerous than anything he had prepared for. By the 3rd week of continuous observation, Commander Arel Venn no longer attempted to predict human behavior before it occurred. He attempted to understand it after. Even that proved unreliable. The data from Ardis 9 had expanded beyond any reasonable archival structure. What had begun as a localized engagement had become a multi-theater conflict. Human vessels did not behave like fleet units in any traditional sense. They behaved like independent systems temporarily aligned toward a shared objective. No central command signature could be isolated. And yet coordination persisted. Arel replayed multiple engagements simultaneously, each from different angles. In every case, the same contradiction appeared. Humans made decisions that should have reduced efficiency. And efficiency increased. He focused on a ground engagement recorded on a colony world designated S-44. The terrain was fractured rock and narrow canyon systems, ideal for defensive suppression, poor for maneuver warfare. The assembly probe force had calculated near-total dominance within 6 hours of landing. Human resistance was expected to collapse quickly. It did not. Arel isolated a single human unit, 9 individuals, pinned between 2 elevated firing positions. Outnumbered, outgunned. Standard doctrine dictated retreat or surrender within minutes. The humans did neither. Instead, they advanced. Arel paused the footage. Rewound. Watched again. Replay trajectory overlay, he ordered. The system complied. The unit moved not away from encirclement, but deeper into it. Not recklessly, but deliberately. Their formation shifted constantly, never remaining in a fixed structure long enough to be targeted predictably. One soldier broke formation entirely, sprinting into open ground. "That is exposure," Irix said immediately. "Yes," Arel replied. The soldier was targeted. The shot missed. Not by error. By timing. The human had moved before the firing solution completed. Arel narrowed his eyes. The others advanced. Not to extract the exposed soldier. Not to retreat. But to widen the engagement zone. Dispersal under fire increases casualty probability by... Irix began. "I know," Arel said. He was already calculating. The probability was catastrophic. And yet, no collapse followed. Instead, the unit's fire increased. Not in volume. In precision. Targets previously concealed behind elevation shifts were eliminated in rapid sequence. The assembly probe force adjusted, attempting to re-establish control of the canyon. That was when the human unit changed behavior again. They stopped moving forward. They stopped moving backward. They began to spread laterally across the terrain. Not randomly. Purposefully. Arel zoomed in. Their spacing formed irregular gaps. At first glance, inefficient. Then the assembly units advanced into those gaps. And were funneled. "Ambush formation," Irix said slowly. Arel did not respond. Because it was not a conventional ambush. There were no fixed kill zones. No static traps. The terrain itself was not the weapon. The humans were. Every movement forced the enemy to adjust. Every adjustment created exposure. Every exposure was exploited immediately. Arel felt a tightening in his chest again. Not fear. Recognition of something that did not match his models. The probe force attempted to regroup. It failed. Because the humans were already inside their decision cycle. Faster. Not physically. Structurally. The humans did not wait for complete information before acting. They acted, then corrected. In real time. The engagement ended in 43 minutes. The probe force withdrew. Not defeated in a traditional sense. But unable to stabilize its own response long enough to continue. Arel sat motionless. 43 minutes. Against a force that should have ended them in 6. Irix broke the silence carefully. "Commander, should I classify this as elite insurgent behavior?" Arel shook his head once. "No." He replayed the final sequence again. The soldier who had sprinted into open ground. The timing gap that should have resulted in immediate elimination. The missed shot by a margin too precise to be coincidence. That moment mattered. Because it was not luck. It was expectation. The humans expected the shot to miss. And acted accordingly. Arel leaned back slowly. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than usual. "They are not reacting to the battlefield," he said. Irix frowned slightly. "Then what are they reacting to?" Arel watched the frozen image of the canyon. The empty space where the soldier had been a second before impact. And the answer formed fully for the first time. "They are reacting to the future," he said. Irix did not respond immediately. Because the statement was not tactical. It was not procedural. It was almost philosophical. Arel continued. "They do not wait for certainty. They assume movement. They assume change. They assume failure and compensate before it occurs. He paused, then added, more carefully, they do not defend positions. Another pause. They defend possibilities. The words hung in the observation deck. Arel reached for his datapad, then stopped, because writing it down would not change it. Understanding it would. He turned back to the display. Multiple engagements still running. Humans across multiple worlds. Same pattern. Always the same contradiction. Chaos on the surface. Precision underneath. And something deeper still. Arel finally allowed himself to acknowledge it. The humans were not unpredictable. They were operating on a predictive model so fast, so adaptive, that external observers could not see it forming. They were not reacting late. They were reacting early. Far earlier than anything he had ever seen. Eirik spoke again, more cautiously this time. Is that sustainable? Arel did not answer immediately. He watched another engagement begin in the distance. Then he said softly, it should not be. A pause. And yet it is. He closed the channel. Not because he was finished observing, but because for the first time in his entire career, he realized observation alone would no longer be enough. He would have to learn how to think like them. And that thought was more unsettling than any battlefield he had ever witnessed. Commander Arel Ven was no longer assigned to a single observation platform. The scope of the human conflict had expanded beyond containment modeling. Entire sectors were now designated active analysis zones. Multiple species within the strategic assembly had begun contributing data, attempting to reconcile what was being observed with established doctrine. None of it aligned. Arel was transferred to a forward liaison station near the Ardis 9 conflict boundary. He did not request the move. He also did not refuse it, because refusal implied certainty, and certainty was something he no longer possessed. The station was quiet compared to the human front lines. Too quiet. Reports arrived in continuous streams, each more difficult to categorize than the last. Human supply chains operating under blockade conditions. Civilian convoys moving through active engagement zones. Local defense groups forming without central coordination. And surviving. More than surviving. Functioning. Arel reviewed one particular dataset repeatedly. Civilian integration patterns. It began on a colony world during the early phase of escalation. He opened the file. The footage showed a settlement under partial evacuation orders. Standard procedure dictated withdrawal. Non-combatants were expected to relocate to secured zones. Instead, they dispersed. Not away from the conflict. Into it. Farmers delivering supplies to forward units. Mechanized workers repurposed into transport roles. Medical personnel setting up triage points in active corridors without authorization. Unauthorized engagement, Eirik noted. Arel did not respond. Because the term felt inadequate. He zoomed in on a convoy moving through a damaged roadway. Civilians. Unarmed. Carrying essential materials toward a forward position still under intermittent fire. The convoy did not stop. It adjusted. Vehicles repositioned around impact zones as if anticipating them. As if they had already mapped where danger would occur. Arel replayed the sequence. 3 times. Each time, the same result. No hesitation. No deviation. No visible command structure. And yet, perfect logistical continuity. Eirik spoke carefully. They are not evacuating. Arel nodded once. No. He leaned forward slightly. They are reinforcing. The words felt heavier than expected. He moved to another file. Ground engagement on Kale 7. This one had already been referenced in earlier reports, but new data had arrived. Civilian population integration had increased from incidental support to direct operational participation. Arel watched a segment repeatedly. A residential area near the combat boundary. An elderly human female, age estimate 71 cycles, stood beside a farming vehicle. It was not designed for military use. It was not armored. It was not fast. A small assembly reconnaissance skiff passed overhead. Standard doctrine dictated non-engagement. Civilians were not expected to respond to aerial surveillance assets. The woman looked up, then moved. She entered the vehicle and drove directly toward the skiff. Arel paused the footage, rewound, watched again. "She is not armed," Irix said. "I know," Arel replied. The vehicle accelerated. Impact followed. The skiff tilted, destabilized, and crashed beyond the settlement boundary. No fatalities recorded. Damage total, complete system failure. Arel did not speak for several seconds. Then he resumed playback. The woman exited the vehicle slowly, checked the damage briefly, then walked away. No panic. No acknowledgement of risk. Only completion. Arel closed the file. For a long moment, neither he nor Irix spoke. Then Irix said quietly, "That was not a combat action." Arel considered this, then corrected her. "It was," he said. "Just not in any format the assembly recognized." He opened another dataset. This one was audio. Intercepted human communications during a prolonged mine tunnel engagement. The recording was distorted, layered with environmental interference. But one segment had been isolated repeatedly across multiple analysis groups. It contained singing. Arel played it. The sound filled the station briefing room. Human voices. Uncoordinated individually. Perfectly aligned collectively. Rhythm without instrumentation. Melody without structure. Repetition without formal composition. It was not tactical communication. It was not coded transmission. It was something else. Arel let it play fully before stopping it. "What is the purpose?" Irix asked. Arel did not answer immediately, because every analytical answer he could generate was insufficient. Morale stimulation. Cognitive stabilization. Group cohesion reinforcement. None of them captured the effect. He reopened the file. Watched the footage again. Humans in a tunnel system. Surrounded. Cut off. Supplies limited. Exhaustion high. And yet, they were singing. Not to signal. Not to coordinate. But to remain together. Arel finally spoke. "They are maintaining continuity of self," he said slowly. Irix frowned slightly. "Self." He nodded. "As a unit." He replayed another segment. A coordinated defense operation where a human squad had been fragmented by enemy fire. Communication breakdown expected. Isolation expected. Instead, the separated units continued operating as if they could still perceive each other. Actions synchronized across distance without direct communication. Arel leaned back. The realization forming was not tactical. It was structural. Humans did not behave as isolated agents. They behaved as distributed systems. He opened a final file. Civilian refugee corridor during active engagement. Thousands of individuals moving through unstable territory. No central command. No visible escort structure. And yet, movement remained coherent. Spacing consistent. Flow uninterrupted. When obstruction occurred, the system adapted instantly. Not through instruction. Through assumption. As if every individual already understood what the whole was doing. Arel closed the file. His voice was quieter now. "They are not civilians and soldiers," he said. Irix looked at him. "Then what are they?" Arel hesitated, because the answer challenged every classification model he had ever used. Then he said, "They are roles within a single behavior system." Silence followed. Arel looked out through the station viewport. The distant conflict zone flickered faintly in the darkness. Human ships. Assembly ships. Movement layered across space like overlapping currents. And beneath it all, something unified. Something persistent. Something that did not break when parts were removed. Irix finally spoke again. "If that is true," she said carefully, "then how do you engage it?" Arel did not answer immediately, because for the first time since the assignment began, he understood the deeper implication of what he was seeing. You did not defeat a system like that by breaking its components, because the components were not the source. He looked at the data again. at the civilians moving into danger without hesitation, at the soldiers singing under fire, at the grandmother walking away from a destroyed skiff as if it were just another resolved task. And he realized something else. They were not separate roles acting in coordination. They were one thing expressing itself differently under pressure. Arel finally answered. "I do not think you engage it," he said. A pause. "You adapt to it." And for Commander Arel Ven, that was the first time the war stopped being about tactics, and started becoming about understanding something he had no framework for at all. The strategic assembly did not collapse under the human conflict. It fractured, quietly at first, then all at once. Commander Arel Ven noticed the shift before it was formally recorded. Reports began arriving out of sequence. Classification standards were inconsistently applied. Entire engagements were summarized instead of analyzed. The language of certainty had begun to fail. Arel stood in the liaison chamber, reviewing a council transmission that had been relayed 3 times before reaching him. The distortion was not technical. It was procedural. The assembly was struggling to describe what it could not stabilize. "Multiple theaters report identical outcomes," Irix said, scanning incoming data streams. "Human forces are maintaining cohesion even under full-spectrum disruption." Arel did not look away from the display. "I know," he said, because he had stopped being surprised. That realization itself unsettled him more than any battlefield report. He opened the latest strategic summary from the Central War Council. It was short, unusually short. Human expansion had been categorized as nonlinear resistance pattern with adaptive escalation behavior. Arel read it twice, then closed it, because it was not wrong. It was just incomplete in a way that made it useless. The conflict on Artus 9 had escalated into what analysts were now calling distributed resistance convergence. A phrase that attempted to describe something no one wanted to define directly. Humans were no longer defending territory. They were reinforcing systems. Every attempt to isolate a region resulted in increased coordination elsewhere. Every attempt to decapitate command structures resulted in local emergence of new leadership patterns. Arel reviewed a battlefield recording. A human convoy under orbital suppression. Standard expectation: dispersion. Instead, the convoy tightened formation. Vehicles did not scatter. They reorganized, as if the act of being targeted had triggered a pre-existing contingency structure. "Is that encoded doctrine?" Irix asked. Arel paused, then replayed the sequence again. "No," he said finally, "because doctrine required transmission. This was not transmitted. It was shared." He leaned forward. The convoy had split into 3 subgroups. Each continued independently, but not separately, because their movement patterns remained synchronized at a level that did not require communication. Arel zoomed in, then froze the frame. "There," he said. Irix leaned closer. "What am I looking at?" Arel pointed at the spacing between units. It was irregular, but consistent. Not random distribution. Not formal spacing. Something in between. "They anticipate each other without signal exchange," Arel said. Irix hesitated. "That is not possible." Arel did not respond, because he had already stopped treating "not possible" as meaningful. He moved to another dataset. Intercepted command discussions from an assembly fleet engagement. The fleet had attempted a coordinated suppression maneuver across 3 human sectors. Initial projections showed overwhelming advantage. Then the humans responded, not with counteroffensive strikes, but with redirection. Arel watched as human forces deliberately abandoned a defensible position. Not due to pressure, but timing. They left exactly when the assembly fleet committed to the attack. Not before. Not after. At the precise moment that maximized exposure. "They are predicting engagement triggers," Irix said slowly. Arel nodded once. "Yes. But that requires knowledge of intent before execution." Arel looked at her. "That is what it looks like," he said. He replayed another segment. A human command transmission. Simple. Unencrypted. Direct. Hold for a moment. Arel paused the audio. I have seen this phrase before, he said quietly. Irix tilted her head. In civilian channels? In combat, Arel corrected. He replayed it. The phrase had appeared in multiple unrelated engagements. Always in moments preceding disruption. Always followed by human control reassertion. Not coincidence. Pattern. Arel stood very still. Then said, they are not reacting to attacks. Irix frowned. Then what are they reacting to? Arel hesitated. Then answered. They are reacting to intent formation. Silence. Irix processed this carefully. You mean they are predicting targeting decisions? Arel shook his head slightly. No. He looked at the display again. At fleets repositioning. At human convoys adapting mid-route. At battlefields reorganizing themselves around unseen pressure points. They are reacting before intent becomes action, he said. That was the line. The one that shifted everything. Because it implied awareness not of movement, but of decision itself. Irix stepped back slightly. That violates cognitive causality limits. Arel gave a faint, tired exhale. Yes, he said. It does. He opened a new file. Then stopped. Because for the first time, he hesitated to classify what he might find. Instead, he turned toward Irix. We have been analyzing them as a species, he said. She nodded cautiously. Yes. Arel continued. That assumption may be incorrect. Irix blinked once. Incorrect how? Arel looked back at the battlefield feed. Human ships moving like a coordinated organism across multiple zones. Not centralized. Not decentralized. Something else. We assumed they are many, he said. A pause. But what if they are behaving like one system that experiences itself as many? Irix did not respond immediately, because the statement had no direct doctrinal translation. Arel stepped closer to the display. Zoomed out. The battlefield expanded. Hundreds of engagements. Thousands of units. Civilian movement patterns. Military formations. All interacting. All adjusting. All maintaining coherence under pressure. He felt something shift in his understanding again. Not fear. Not certainty. Something closer to humility. They do not break when separated, he said quietly. They reconfigure. Irix finally spoke. Commander, what does that mean for engagement strategy? Arel did not answer immediately, because the answer was no longer tactical. It was existential. He looked at the data one more time, then said, it means separation is not disruption. A pause. It is input. And for the first time in his service record spanning 31 years, Commander Arel Ven understood that the humans were not adapting to war. War was adapting to them. The final report was not written on a battlefield. It was written in silence. Commander Arel Ven requested isolation aboard the observation vessel stationed at the edge of the Artis Convergence Zone. No tactical feeds. No real-time engagement data. Only archived records. The Assembly granted it immediately. Not out of trust. Out of uncertainty. Because by now, uncertainty had become standard. Arel sat at the data console for a long time without activating it. For the first time in his career, he did not feel pressure to conclude quickly. Not because the urgency had diminished, but because he understood that rushing would not change what was already true. He finally opened the terminal. A blank report field appeared. Designation: Final Strategic Assessment, Human Species. He stared at it, then began typing. I have observed 42 species across 9 star systems. I have recorded behavioral frameworks under conditions of extinction pressure, resource collapse, ideological fragmentation, and total war. I have never encountered a species that behaves like this. He paused, not because he was unsure, but because language itself felt insufficient. He continued, the human species does not operate within standard predictive military frameworks. Their actions cannot be accurately modeled through conventional probability systems because they do not stabilize around expected outcomes. They stabilize around continuation. Arel stopped again. He replayed the phrase in his mind. Continuation. Not victory. Not survival. Continuation. He continued typing. When faced with overwhelming odds, most species calculate loss thresholds and adjust behavior toward preservation. Humans do not. They incorporate loss as a variable in ongoing function. They do not retreat to avoid destruction. They reposition destruction as part of process. He leaned back slightly. The observation had been forming in him for weeks, but only now did it become clear enough to write without hesitation. He continued. Human combat behavior is not driven primarily by aggression, fear, or survival instinct. It is driven by narrative persistence. They act as if outcomes are not final states, but transitional states in a larger sequence that has not yet completed. Arel paused. This was the point where previous drafts had broken down, where language failed and emotion had begun to leak into the record. He did not allow that this time. He continued. In all observed engagements, humans demonstrate a consistent refusal to accept termination conditions while operational capacity remains. This behavior is not irrational. It is structurally consistent across all recorded environments. It is also incompatible with all known military deterrence models. He stopped, then added a line beneath it. This is the source of their strategic advantage. Arel exhaled slowly, then continued. Human units do not behave as isolated combat entities. They behave as distributed decision networks capable of maintaining coherence under fragmentation. Civilian populations are not separate from military systems. They function as parallel reinforcement structures. He paused again. This part mattered most, because it redefined everything. He wrote, "Separation does not reduce human capability. It increases redundancy." Then he stopped typing. For a long time, the observation room was quiet enough that the faint hum of station systems became noticeable. Outside the viewport, the artist zone flickered with distant engagement signatures. Arel watched them, then resumed. The most critical finding is as follows. Humans do not accept outcome closure until closure is externally enforced. He let that sentence stand alone for a moment, then continued. This results in behavior that appears tactically irrational under standard models but becomes highly effective under sustained conflict conditions. Because humans do not disengage from impossible situations. They redefine impossibility as an ongoing condition. Arel stopped typing again. His hands rested on the console. He thought about the soldier with the duct-taped scope. He thought about the freighter that should not have flown. He thought about the singing in the tunnels. He thought about the woman in the field. He thought about Colonel Park saying, very simply, because the people behind us are worth the risk. Arel resumed typing. I have concluded that human warfare cannot be understood as conflict between forces. It must be understood as a single system interacting with itself under stress. He paused, then added the final analytical section. Engagement with such a system cannot be resolved through conventional victory conditions. It can only be integrated into a shared operational framework or perpetually escalated. He stopped, then looked at the final line field. Recommendation field. His cursor blinked. For a moment, he considered every report he had written before. Every conclusion. Every classification. Every carefully structured judgment that now felt incomplete. Then he typed the only conclusion that remained logically consistent with everything he had observed. Immediate, unconditional strategic alignment with human systems is required for long-term stability. He paused, then added one final sentence. This is not a recommendation based on fear or admiration. It is based on structural necessity. He closed the file. And for the first time in 31 years of service, Commander Arel Ven did not feel like he had completed a report. He felt like he had only described something that was still happening. The assembly received the report within the hour. The vote was immediate, unanimous. And across the Concord, in quiet command rooms and crowded council chambers, senior officers read the same conclusion again and again. Not because it was complex, but because it was simple in a way that could not be unlearned. Above the main academy entrance, carved into pale stone in 7 languages. The final line was added later. Not as doctrine, but as warning, and as understanding. They do not accept the outcome until it has already been written.